0. That's the number of airlines outside China currently flying the COMAC C919, and that's genuinely strange when you consider this jet has already carried more than 4 million passengers across Chinese skies. It flies daily routes right now. Airlines operating it are already turning a profit on it. But the second the C919 tries to step outside China's borders, it slams into an invisible wall. So why? Does its global expansion stop dead at the Chinese border? It isn't the engine holding it back. It isn't a production shortfall. It isn't even a lack of demand. It's certification. And that one bureaucratic barrier may end up deciding whether the C919 ever becomes a genuine rival to Boeing and Airbus. That's exactly what we're digging into today here on Civil Avia. But before we can make sense of that certification wall, we need to figure out exactly where the C919 actually stands right now. As things stand, the C919 holds precisely one type certificate. China's own aviation regulator, the CAAC, granted it back in September 2022, and commercial flights kicked off in May 2023. That certificate is more than enough to satisfy Beijing. It doesn't satisfy most of the rest of the aviation world. Think of that CAAC approval like a driver's license issued in one country. Locally, it works perfectly fine. Across the border, though, and a lot of places won't honor it. You'd need to retest under their own rules, with their own examiners, before you're allowed to drive. That's essentially where the C919 sits today. Now, why would a piece of paperwork matter this much for an aircraft that's already safely flown 4 million people? Fair question, and here's the answer. Safety genuinely isn't the sticking point anymore. Official sign-off is. Insurance underwriters lean on that certificate to price risk. Leasing companies depend on it just as heavily, and leasing is how roughly half of Boeing and Airbus customers actually get their aircraft in the first place. Picture a global leasing firm wanting to buy a fleet of C919s and lease them out worldwide. In most cases, that deal simply doesn't work without Western recognized certification behind it. And here's the kicker. Dozens of countries, scattered across Europe, plus large parts of Asia and Africa, don't write their own airworthiness rulebooks from scratch. They just adopt EASA's standards wholesale, which means one missing signature, sitting in an office in Cologne, quietly locks the C919 out of a massive chunk of the planet, including countries that have never sent a single inspector anywhere near Shanghai. So loop one closes right there. Paperwork is grounding this aircraft internationally. Not physics, not engineering, not safety data. So who's actually lining up to buy it then? Turns out, quite a few carriers are genuinely interested. Take AirAsia as an example. At an aviation summit in Hong Kong, Capital A's CEO Tony Fernandez revealed the airline is in active talks with COMAC over the C919. He went further, arguing that much of the aviation industry is seriously underestimating this aircraft, and that writing it off would be a mistake. But here's where the story gets genuinely strange. So far, only one airline outside mainland China has actually placed a firm signed order for the C919, Brunei-based startup Gallop Air. Back in 2023, they inked a deal worth roughly $2 billion for 15 C919s. On paper, that looked like the breakthrough everyone was waiting for. Except there's a catch. When Gallop Air finally launched passenger service on New Year's Eve 2024, the aircraft in the sky wasn't a C919 at all. It was the smaller C909 regional jet. Why the switch? Because the C919 legally still couldn't operate international commercial flights running solely on its Chinese-issued certification. And Gallop Air isn't the only carrier stuck in this holding pattern. Brazil's Total Linhas Aéreas has repeatedly expressed interest. Vietnam Airlines' CEO has publicly stated the carrier would consider ordering the jet, but only once it clears international certification. Indonesia's Garuda, Kazakhstan's Escat, and Cambodia's Air Cambodia have all explored the aircraft too. Even Ryanair's Michael O'Leary has said he'd consider buying COMAC jets if they were priced roughly 20% below equivalent Boeing aircraft. Notice the pattern here. Interest is everywhere. Signed contracts are nowhere. And every single one of these airlines is stuck waiting on the exact same missing piece of paper. Quick pause here, because if this wall is as real as it sounds, you're going to want to stick around and see exactly how COMAC is trying to knock it down over the next few minutes. So go ahead and hit subscribe now before we get into that part. Appreciate it. Okay, so is anyone actually making progress against this wall? As it turns out, yes, sort of. European regulators have started flying the C919 themselves. EASA test pilots have been stationed in Shanghai, running validation flights and putting the aircraft through its paces firsthand. That counts as progress, right? Sure, but how fast is it moving? Slowly, very slowly. EASA wrapped its fourth round of on-site reviews back in 2024. COMAC originally hoped for full European approval sometime around 2025. Then EASA's own executive director shut that expectation down flatly. describing a realistic timeline of 3 to 6 years instead. By 2025, European officials were pointing toward 2028 as the earliest plausible date for certification, with some estimates suggesting it could slip as far as 2031. Picture a house undergoing renovation one room at a time, with a single inspector working through it slowly, while the prospective buyer just stands outside on the sidewalk, waiting. That's basically this certification timeline in a nutshell. The finish line keeps drifting further away, almost every year, and the American side of this wall is even quieter. The FAA's process for the C919 essentially isn't moving at all right now, which keeps the US market closed off for the foreseeable future, regardless of how many passengers fly safely inside China every single day. Quick gut check before we keep going. Do you think Europe actually certifies this aircraft before 2030? Drop a yes or no in the comments. I'll pin the top response. Here's the twist almost nobody saw coming. The aircraft trying to break free of Western dependency still runs largely on Western parts. By value, researchers estimate that the C919 sources roughly 60% of its components from outside China. Just the engines alone, the CFM, LEAP-1C, account for around 30% of the aircraft's total cost. Those are built jointly by America's GE and France's Safran. Stack Honeywell's flight control systems and Collins Aerospace's avionics on top of that, and the picture becomes pretty clear. This aircraft isn't fully Chinese yet, not by a long shot. And here's why that matters so much. In 2025, Washington suspended export licenses covering those exact engines, along with key Honeywell and Collins components. Production froze for several weeks straight. COMAC had planned to deliver dozens of jets that year. Almost none of them actually left the factory floor on schedule. Washington eventually restored those licenses in early July, and deliveries picked back up from there. Picture building your own house specifically to cut ties with your neighbor, only to realize the electricity still runs through a meter sitting on their property. They can flip that switch whenever they decide to. So the certification wall and the supply chain wall aren't really two separate problems at all. They're the same wall, just built out of different bricks. One keeps the C919 locked out of foreign markets. The other lets foreign suppliers throttle exactly how many aircraft COMAC can even physically build in the first place. So how is COMAC actually responding to all of this? Turns out they're not just sitting around waiting for Brussels to sign off. China's latest 5-year economic plan, covering 2026 through 2030, spells it out directly. Accelerate development of a fully homegrown engine, the CJ1000A, and cut reliance on Western avionics and flight systems wherever it's realistically possible to do so. That engine has already completed testing runs aboard a modified military transport aircraft. Realistically, though, the C919 almost certainly won't be flying commercially with it before the end of the decade. Here's the more interesting part, though. COMAC isn't only trying to knock the existing wall down brick by brick. They're also quietly building a second door that skips EASA's approval entirely. Cambodia just signed a bulk order for 20 of COMAC's smaller C909 jets. The C919 itself is gearing up to fly its first international route into a neighboring country without waiting on a single Western signature at all. Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and chunks of Latin America all have regulators willing to approve an aircraft entirely on their own national terms, EASA stamp or no EASA stamp. So, picture two strategies running in parallel. Strategy 1, keep climbing the existing wall, sit through years more of EASA reviews, and hope Washington eventually reopens the FAA process for good. Strategy 2, route around the wall completely, sell into markets that never demanded a Western certificate to begin with, and lean on China's own enormous domestic order book to keep factories running at full tilt in the meantime. Either way, it flips the entire question we opened this video with. It's not really, will Europe or America ever certify the C919? It's whether COMAC even needs that certificate anymore, whether they can build a sustainable global customer base without ever fully crossing this particular wall at all. Now, that workaround strategy has real limits baked into it. Route around this wall for too long, and the C919 risks staying a permanently regional player, respected across Phnom Penh and Jakarta, functionally invisible in Frankfurt or New York. Airlines like AirAsia, the exact carriers who could actually put this aircraft on major global trunk routes, are still stuck waiting on that same missing signature. And every year, EASA's timeline slips further. Boeing and Airbus quietly bank more time to fix their own well-documented production headaches. So here's the actual fight worth watching closely. It isn't whether the C919 can fly. It obviously already can, and does, every single day. The real fight is whether Boeing and Airbus lose meaningful ground first in the markets that genuinely don't care about EASA approval, or whether COMAC runs out of patience and runway before that certificate ever actually materializes. Either way, that wall doesn't move on its own. Something on one side of it has to give first. So really, the entire future of the C919 program comes down to two variables: how fast as a certification actually moves over the coming years, and whether China can build a global ecosystem strong enough to matter commercially before that certification ever arrives. Whatever ultimately happens, this program already stands as serious proof of exactly how far China's aviation ambitions have come in a remarkably short window of time. So what do you think? Which airline finally flies the C919 outside China first? Drop your pick down in the comments. And speaking of Russian aviation ambitions running into their own version of this exact problem, here's a story breaking just as we finish putting this video together. Russia has pushed back certification of the MC21-310 once again, not by a matter of weeks, but by another full year. After more than 200 test flights logged, plenty of observers genuinely expected this program to be closing in on the finish line. Instead, on May 7th, during a meeting with President Vladimir Putin, Russia's own state industrial chief confirmed that certification is now expected sometime in 2027. It wasn't a failed flight test that caused the slip. It wasn't a safety scare either, and that's exactly what makes this story so unusual. The biggest obstacle facing the MC-21 isn't getting the aircraft into the air, it's getting the paperwork across the finish line. So why does the certification date keep sliding even after years of accumulated flight testing? And if the MC-21 can't enter service on schedule, what does that actually mean for Russia's broader plan to challenge Boeing and Airbus? Let's dig into it. Let's start with exactly what happened. On May 7th, during that meeting with President Putin, Rostec's CEO Sergei Chemezov confirmed that the MC-21-310 was expected to complete certification sometime in 2027. At that point, roughly a third of the required certification flights had actually been completed. That already sounded like another delay layered on top of previous ones. Then the story shifted again. Just 7 weeks later, during Putin's visit to the Zhukovsky airfield, officials revealed that around 100 of the roughly 200 required certification flights had now been completed. More importantly, they confirmed the flight test campaign itself would continue all the way through June 2027, with full type certification only expected toward the very end of that year. That might sound like a fairly small scheduling adjustment. It isn't. Imagine you're told your house's construction will wrap up next spring. Then, before summer even arrives, the contractor quietly informs you the walls themselves won't even be finished until next summer, and you'll be handed the keys months after that. That's essentially what just happened here. A deadline sliding again while the ink on the previous announcement is still wet. And this isn't even a new pattern for this particular program. It's roughly the fifth or sixth time the MC-21's certification date has shifted, stretching all the way back to an original target of 2020. Worth grounding this in something concrete, though, because it's easy to read all of this as pure vaporware. The first fully import-substituted MC-21-310, meaning every single major system built entirely domestically, actually flew for the first time back in 2025. So this isn't a paper program stuck permanently in a PowerPoint deck somewhere. It's a real physical aircraft already in the air, just still working its way through an enormous mountain of certification paperwork. The first big reason behind the delays comes down to composite materials, which sounds like an oddly narrow explanation, doesn't it? But that single design choice may explain why the MC-21's certification process has become so much more complicated than many people originally expected. Rewind back to 2018. Washington sanctioned the Russian firm responsible for the MC-21's signature feature, its so-called black wing. Here's the easiest way to picture it. Most airliner wings are built from aluminum, stamped and riveted together, not unlike the way a soda can is assembled. This aircraft's wing, by contrast, is carbon fiber composite, closer in spirit to a high-end racing bike frame. Lighter, stiffer, but dramatically harder to manufacture reliably. The carbon fiber feeding that wing originally came from an American company, Hexcel, and a Japanese company, Toray. Sanctions cut off that supply chain essentially overnight. Russian engineers themselves have openly admitted that losing access to that imported carbon fiber was the first genuinely serious hit the program took. So Russia did something it hadn't originally planned on doing. It built an entirely new domestic carbon fiber supply chain from scratch. Today, a company called Umatex produces the carbon fiber used in the MC-21's composite wings, churning out more than 1,400 metric tons of the material annually. That means one of the aircraft's most strategically important components no longer depends on any Western supplier whatsoever. And those wings genuinely matter for performance. The composite wing is lighter than a traditional aluminum one, which lets engineers build it proportionally longer without piling on excess weight. Picture the long, narrow wing of a glider rather than the short, stubby wing of a crop duster. Less drag, meaningfully better fuel efficiency. That's the reasoning behind Russian industry's claim that the MC-21 could burn up to 8% less fuel than comparable single-aisle competitors, though it's worth flagging that figure hasn't been independently verified by any outside body. Either way, this is one of the biggest reasons the schedule keeps slipping. The MC21 program isn't just certifying a single aircraft, it's simultaneously certifying an entire industrial ecosystem that barely existed a decade ago. And composite materials are only the first half of the story. The next major challenge might be even tougher, the engines. Before we get into that part, if you're enjoying the kind of aviation deep dives we put together here on Civil Avia, go ahead and consider subscribing to the channel. Every single subscriber genuinely matters, and I personally notice every milestone we hit. Your support is what lets us keep researching, keep analyzing, and keep bringing you the best stories in commercial aviation. So thank you for being part of this. Now, back to the engine story. This is really where Russia is trying to prove itself because the new composite wing needed a brand new engine to match it. This aircraft runs on the Aviad Vigatel PD-14, Russia's own domestically developed turbofan, replacing the Pratt & Whitney engine option used on earlier prototype variants. But swapping an engine isn't remotely like swapping out a car part. The engine is essentially the heart of the aircraft. Change the heart, and engineers have to recheck nearly everything connected to it, from flight performance and fuel efficiency to reliability data and the certification paperwork tied to all of it. Russia didn't just have to design and build a new engine. It had to build the entire supporting ecosystem around that engine. New factories, new supplier networks, new testing procedures, new maintenance systems from the ground up. That created an absolutely massive amount of additional work, because certifying any new aircraft is already a genuinely difficult process on its own. Certifying an aircraft powered by a brand new domestic engine developed entirely outside the established Western supply chain adds a whole extra layer of complexity on top of that. And that's one major reason the MC21 timeline keeps moving further out. Now, to be fair, the PD-14 has already been through a substantial amount of testing. During recent certification flights, the MC21 310 flew roughly 3,800 kilometers, which is about the same distance separating New York and Los Angeles, while carrying a payload comparable to a full passenger load. The aircraft has also received approval to carry up to 201 passengers in its highest density seating configuration, which demonstrates the design can realistically handle the kind of high-capacity routes carriers like Aeroflot actually need in daily operation. At the very least, that's a genuinely encouraging signal. So, given all of these obstacles stacked on top of each other, why does Russia actually need the MC-21 so badly? Before 2022, Russia's commercial aviation system leaned heavily on Western-built aircraft. Thousands of Boeing and Airbus jets carried the overwhelming majority of Russian domestic passengers. Then everything changed almost overnight. Once sanctions cut off official access to most Western spare parts and maintenance support channels, airlines had to scramble for another way to keep their existing fleets airworthy. One workaround became known as cannibalization. The concept is straightforward. Strip parts off one aircraft to keep a different aircraft flying. Think of it like keeping an old car running by scavenging parts from a second vehicle sitting idle in the garage. Except in this case, the garage is an entire national airline fleet. The problem became especially acute with newer aircraft types. Some of Russia's newest Airbus A320neo and A321neo jets turned out to be among the hardest to support, precisely because they were too recently introduced for any large second-hand parts market to have developed around them yet. But here's where the story gets more complicated than the simple doom narrative you might expect. Predictions that Russia's entire fleet would collapse quickly didn't fully pan out. Russian carriers kept operating, and China became an important alternative source for aircraft components along the way. So the situation was never quite as simple as sanctions grounded everything. Russia found ways to keep the planes flying. But keeping existing Boeing and Airbus aircraft airborne through improvised workarounds is fundamentally different from actually owning the underlying technology outright. And that's precisely where the MC-21 enters the picture. The MC-21 was never designed because Russia wanted to beat Boeing head-to-head on a London to New York route. It was designed because Russia wanted an aircraft it could build, maintain, and support entirely on its own terms, without depending on decisions made by governments outside its borders. The goal was never really global market domination. The goal was independence, plain and simple. Which brings us to the biggest question hanging over the MC-21 program today. Can Russia actually manufacture enough of these aircraft to meaningfully replace its aging Boeing and Airbus fleet? It depends heavily on execution. Rostec's own stated target for 2030 calls for 36 MC-21s a year, alongside 20 SJ-100 regional jets and 12 AL-114-300 turboprops. Add all three programs together and you land at roughly 68 aircraft a year across the entire combined lineup. Boeing and Airbus, even while wrestling with their own well-documented production headaches, still each deliver hundreds of single-aisle jets annually on their own. Then there's the underlying supply chain itself to consider. Composite production, specialized components, avionics. Much of Russia's domestic aerospace ecosystem is still actively learning as it builds, rather than operating at steady, mature manufacturing capacity. And then there's reliability, which has to be earned through accumulated real-world experience, not simply announced in a press release. Every new aircraft type needs a substantial number of accumulated flight hours in actual airline service before crews and passengers genuinely trust it day to day. So finally, does any of this actually threaten Boeing or Airbus directly? Before I give you my own take, I want to hear yours first. Just drop a yes or no in the comments. I'm curious whether your read on this matches mine. Most analysts broadly agree the MC21 is unlikely to ever secure certification from America's FAA or Europe's EASA. That's not some minor technicality either. It effectively means exports will realistically stay confined to Russia itself, plus a small handful of friendly markets willing to operate outside Western certification standards entirely. So on a global route map, this program isn't touching Boeing or Airbus's core markets anytime soon. But here's the real twist. That was never actually the point. The genuine answer to the bigger question isn't about market share at all. It's about precedent. This program proves that a modern commercial airliner can, in fact, be built largely outside the traditional Western aerospace supply chain, entirely homegrown from the ground up. If a sanctioned cut-off aviation industry can pull that off, however slowly, however many times the calendar keeps sliding, other countries chasing their own version of aviation independence will absolutely be watching closely. It's essentially a blueprint other nations might eventually try to copy for themselves. Both of these stories, the C919 fighting to break out of China and the MC21 fighting to break free of Western dependency, are really two sides of the exact same coin. Certification, supply chains, and sanctions have quietly become just as decisive in modern aviation as engineering itself. Building an aircraft that flies safely turns out to be only half the battle. Proving it to the rest of the world, on paper, under someone else's rulebook, might be the harder fight of the two. And if you want to dig deeper into more stories covering Russian aircraft programs and the ambitions driving them, check out the video on your screen right now. Click it and keep watching. Thanks for sticking around. I'll see you in the next one.